Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for inviting me into your home this week. We are going to talk about gaslighting. And in order to do that, I have a guest, Dr. Robin Stern, and she is, let me do a little intro on her and then we will introduce her. She is co-founder and associate director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. She's a licensed psychoanalyst with 30 years of experience treating individuals, couples, and families, and she is the author of 2 books, which I found absolutely fascinating. One of them is called, yes, you're very welcome. One of them is called, let me get the books here, The Gaslight Effect. And then more recently, coming out now, is the Gaslight Effect Recovery Guide. And reading through those, I was certainly impressed by your knowledge and description and use of examples of the concept of gaslighting. So Dr. Stern, Robin Stern, welcome to my show.
Chris, thank you so much for having me with you and for elevating this really important topic and including it in your podcast series. I am really thrilled to have the opportunity to talk openly and publicly about gaslighting as much as possible. And so this is a really wonderful opportunity, especially given what you do bring to the people who listen and what you've been through yourself. I'm fascinated by just our very brief conversation early on and have a ton of questions for you. But where would you like us to start?
Absolutely. Yeah, I am sure we could have a very, very interesting set of discussions about all of this. Well, I'd like to start first off by saying I really, really liked your books. And I thought that they were informative in a way that often, some people who come out of academia or are very academic are not so good at that. and the science communication part of this is such an important part because gaslighting as a concept it gets watered down, at least when you look at it on social media or you look at it in the public discourse, that people will tend to take these terms that have very detailed or very specific definitions or ideas connected with them, and they'll tend to water them down. Somebody lies to you, oh, he's gaslighting me. Somebody's a little selfish, oh, he's a narcissist, this kind of thing. And I'm always railing against that. I guess I wanted to start with asking, what's your take on that?
Well, it's funny that you asked me that question because I railed against it out loud in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month and a half ago, with my colleague from Yale, Mark Brackett. And we talked about how often these words that where maybe they're therapy words or akin to some therapy words, but certainly words that are about the human experience are misused, to use your expression, watered down, certainly weaponized and not specific in a way that is helpful. So I think and I appreciate the compliments about my book, but what is helpful about my book and my writing is that people feel like I've been sitting in their living room. People feel like I've been like a fly on the wall and listening to the conversations. And in fact, in some way I have, because I've been listening to people talk about their gaslighting experiences from both sides of the gaslighting dyad for 30 years and have been fascinated by it. And so I think that it is so important, and it's part of my calling, if you will, to bring this out to the world in a way that people can hear it. So as an academic, I'm not as interested in writing for journals and where other psychoanalysts and psychologists can read about it, although that I've done a little bit of that. It's not my forte. It's not my strong suit. It is my strong suit to speak to people in plain English and to describe the experiences that they're having. I care much more about what actually happens between people than using a lot of language that is, many people say jargon, it's technical, to describe it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you dive into the literature and of course very big words to describe behavior that we all run into every day. I'm curious how this became your, almost area of, I was happy to see this is not all you focus on. You deal with you do a lot of work around emotions and understanding emotions and emotional reactions. And I have been talking for quite some time now, months, maybe a year, about emotional needs and the very, very important factor or role that they play in our behavior, in why we behave the way that we do. People like to think that they're rational and logical and they sort of think things through, but really so much of our behavior is driven by our emotions, and gaslighting is an aspect of that in a way. So I was really happy to see you got a lot of work under your belt on all of this. What was it that prompted or interested you about all of this in the first place?
Thank you for the question. So I have been fortunate to work with both women and men, but and people who are non-binary and all kinds of relationships. However, the people I saw the most, or the pairing that I saw the most in my practice, were women coming in talking about their male gaslighters. And at least for many years, I would say for over a decade, that's what the presentation was in my practice. And maybe some of that was because I was involved in a Women's Leadership Institute. And so some of the women, when they heard what I was working on, what I was interested in, came to my private practice. And also women tend to come to therapy more easily about these things. And also women tend to give up their feelings more easily in those kinds of power dynamic driven relationships than men, in my experience.
Sure.
And I had always liked the 1944 movie starring Charles Boyer and Ingrid Bergman that is called Gaslight. And if you have you seen the movie?
I have, absolutely.
Okay. I was going to offer to play you a little excerpt, but we don't have to do that.
Fair enough.
But I would recommend that people watch the movie because it's a snapshot. And at the beginning, an 8-minute segment happens where you see this loving and confident, smart and calm woman who is easily dismissing something that her husband is saying to her. "You're so forgetful, Paula. You tend to forget things," he says to her as he's giving her a gift. And she says, "Don't be silly." "I do? I didn't realize that." And then he asks her to double check. "Well, are you sure you actually put this brooch," is what he gives her, a fair family heirloom, in this bag she's carrying? And he says, "Are you sure you put it in there?" And she's like, "Don't be silly, of course." To 8 minutes later in the movie, and it could be 8 weeks later or 8 months later in real life, her saying, "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am that forgetful." Right. And what resonated with me is that many of my friends and many patients and clients who were otherwise strong women, strong-minded, easily decisions came easily to them, happy and connected to their boyfriends, their husbands, their families equally, suddenly were isolating from family and friends, and in their primary intimate relationship were second-guessing their phone number, second-guessing their feelings. And just to connect to what you said about emotions and how they drive things, one of the ways that gaslighting goes forward is that there is an abandoning of honoring your own emotions. And in that dynamic, you might feel anxious, you might feel scared in the moment, but you're only interested in what that's driving you to, which is to stay connected to this guy. Let's just say this guy, and to do what he wants, and to use a psychological term, but not so psychologically, to join him in his vision of the world. Right. Very often when you're involved with somebody, you like that, imagining you're holding hands, walking into the sunset, seeing the world in the same way. People like to do that. They like that kind of togetherness. And particularly women who are, and this is a little bit perhaps outdated to some people, but it's still pretty present in my belief system because I'm seeing it in my practice still. And women are socialized to be pleasing, to be accommodating, and to be empathic, to take the other side. And sometimes we get so stuck in the other side that we forget we have a side.
Yes. Yeah. Good point.
So I was fascinated with how strong women were suddenly not so strong in their relationships and could barely remember their same strong selves, and were having trouble making decisions, and were feeling crazy and confused. And what I noticed over and over again is because there was no apparent bruise on their arm, cursing and screaming they could point to, this kind of undermining, which I'm sure is part of the grooming process also of bringing someone into a cult.
Oh, yeah.
It's like something is happening and you don't know quite what it is. And so when you feel bad in a relationship or you think something is crazy, women are much more likely to point their finger at themselves and say, what's wrong with me?
Right.
And I'll share with you, Chris, and with our listeners that it happened to me. And it happened to me while I was writing the book and doing research. And I was married, my ex-husband, to someone who was a good guy gaslighter. He was very affable, very pleasant, easy to be with. And yet we had this continuous interaction over him being late. And I would complain about it. I would sometimes get emotional about it, feeling disrespected, and that every single time I was making dinner, we were supposed to be somewhere, he was very late. And his response to that was, there's something wrong with the way you see time. And I initially would say, oh, that's ridiculous. Or no, there isn't. And I don't like it. Plain and simple, don't like it. But over time, as he persisted in saying, you're way too rigid about time. What did your parents teach you? You really have a problem with time. I began to think, gee, did I grow up with this conception of time that is really so rigid that I just was so blind to never noticing it? And as I was saying it to myself, I was thinking, no, I'm writing about this. I know better. And yet the emotional pull to want to be part of, to be joined with him and not to be fighting with him and to have him think well of me, which he only would do if I agreed with his reality, was very powerful.
Right. How interesting, because you've actually given a great example here of certainly of gaslighting, but also I can't help but relate it to the concept of coercive control, and how coercive control basically, is isolation, manipulation, and control. And gaslighting would be on the manipulation side of that. You isolate a person, of course, and then it's much more effective because other people aren't around to argue about it. And you can just start having your way with the person. And it's also, by definition, a repeating pattern of behavior. It's not a one-off. It happens, and then it happens again, and then it happens again. And it doesn't have to be physically abusive in order for it to be coercive control. And gaslighting is therefore one of the, sort of pillars of how coercive control manifests in domestic relationships. And so there's domestic violence, but then there's also sort of domestic passive aggressiveness, this other thing that happens that's not violence, and yet it can make a person anxious and even traumatized, like violence will do. How does that happen with gaslighting as you've seen play out in relationships you've seen or dealt with?
Well, thank you for bringing us to that point. I think that there is isolation when it comes to gaslighting relationships, but it happens after the manipulation. So manipulation goes on for a while, and people tell me I couldn't talk about the relationship anymore because I didn't feel comfortable with what I would have to say, or I was ashamed that I would put up with that, or I wasn't sure who was right and who was wrong. And when you live with that kind of uncertainty over time, and then you become isolated, and then you learn how to gaslight yourself. You don't even need your partner after a while because you can play his part, and you're exhausting yourself by going back and forth. Is he right? Is he wrong? Am I right? Am I wrong? You're living with all this anxiety. You can become seriously depressed because you're isolated. You're not making decisions well. Your performance is impaired. And we know from emotion science that when you're very activated, it's harder to remember things. It's harder to think clearly. It is harder to make decisions. So the work that I do at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence and have done for all these years really dovetails very nicely in both being taking a part of explaining what's happening and why it's so emotionally devastating, and also what gives us some guidance and some tips about how to manage it in the moment and ultimately to get out, managing your emotions around all of it. But you had sent me a series of questions, and one of them was about this. How does gaslighting lead to trauma? Well, gaslighting can itself feel traumatizing. Right. But I want to be careful with that word because that's another word that is misused and weaponized, and it's many times not really trauma that people are feeling. They're just feeling really terrible and really boxed in and really unable to cope. And when you feel that way for a long time, you can feel like you certainly have been through traumatic experiences. But when people go through trauma and they are experiencing the traumatic aftermath, it tends to lessen over time. But when you are constantly in it, it's not lessening. So you're in this kind of soup of confusion, destabilization, and what feels like toxic stress.
Yeah, exactly. Having been in
toxic stress.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you actually before I get to that, let me ask you, because you correctly brought this up about trauma and how it also gets, watered down in the common vernacular. What are we talking about when we talk about something being taken to the level of trauma? How do we think about, or how should we be thinking about that versus I'm feeling very uncomfortable, I'm feeling very upset, I'm mad, I'm even raging? That's different. And how is it different?
It's different because we live in a world where there are upsetting experiences. And if every time you're upset, you are describing yourself as being traumatized, first of all, it's wrong. Secondly, it's not helpful. I mean, probably drawing from a lot of different things, and tell me if I'm too off the page that you want me to be on. But we are experiencing a loneliness epidemic and part of what feeds that is disconnection. I mean, there are lots of reasons for that: pandemic, technology, et cetera. One of the reasons is that it's hard to connect with people when you don't know what you feel. You can't communicate about it. And if you're constantly mislabeling your own feelings, then you're telling yourself a story in a way that is hard to then communicate what's authentically going on with somebody else. So if I'm upset with you because we were supposed to meet at 6 for dinner, or you were going to give me a document you were working on, and I'm waiting for it, and I'm disappointed because I was really waiting for it.
Mm-hmm.
If I can communicate that to you, and you can hear my disappointment, and you can maybe apologize, hopefully apologize, and then we can have a different interaction next time where you better respect the boundaries or the timeline or whatever. That's great. If I say to you, I'm traumatized, like I've been standing here for 20 minutes and I'm traumatized, or come on, Chris, like where's the document? You're traumatizing me.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
Right. Right.
So in some sense, it loses its meaning. It's great that people are brave enough to talk about mental health issues, but it's not great when people can't be specifically, let me say that in a more positive way.
Of course.
It's much better when people can be granular about what they feel and talk specifically and accurately about the feeling they're having, so that the person on the other end knows. Because after all, it's a basic human need to feel seen and understood.
That's right. That's right.
And when I think about, like, just bringing this back to this conversation, when I think about what's happening in cults,
mm-hmm.
and you tell me, because you were there,
mm-hmm.
like they're not interested in your feelings.
Oh, no. It's not about your
feelings.
It's not about your feelings at all. In fact, I was going to go there because it leads right to this. Would you agree, or would you say or describe that there are layers of the consequences or the effects of a concentrated campaign of gaslighting on a person? I mean, there's
absolutely.
You just keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and the effects become stronger and stronger to the point where they do become trauma.
I'm where they can.
Yeah.
They can become trauma.
Yes.
Certainly they're stressed to the point where you can't handle it anymore. When you're at the point where you are not functioning because of what's happening, then you are experiencing trauma to your system.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to just to comment really quickly on what we were just talking about there, what you were describing with the communication of how you were feeling, and then bringing in these, bigger words: gaslighting, trauma, narcissism. Right. I think one of the big problems with that is that a person will then start defining or identifying themselves in ways that are actually much more serious than they really are, and can get a self-image that is not really reflective of the reality of the situation for their own mental health, and they can think
it doesn't allow them to move forward. I can't because I'm traumatized. One of the things that I think is a really important distinction is that not every traumatic situation, or for example, even after 9/11, or even after a car crash, or even after a horrific fire in a school, for example, not everyone is traumatized by that situation.
Right. That's right.
So I have many conversations with a colleague at Columbia who you might want to have on your show, George Bonanno, who's an expert in trauma and resilience. And he talks a lot about potential trauma. Like, there is potential trauma in gaslighting relationships, for sure. It doesn't mean that everyone will experience trauma.
Right.
Gaslighting relationship.
That makes sense.
It really depends on what you walk in with, what kind of resilience, what kind of emotional gifts, if you will, what kind of emotional strategies you walk in with.
Sure. I imagine it might also help having good connections that you can unload to, or that you can talk to, or that you can bounce ideas off of, where the effect of the gaslighter is mitigated or minimized by. It's crazy, right? Kind of conversations.
It's very often, and even in the 1944 movie, it's a third party suddenly wakes you up to the fact that, wait a minute, this is crazy. Right. How did you get out? Like, did that happen for you? Was it other people who helped you?
Oh, me in terms of my cult experience?
Yeah.
I woke up, sort of got myself out on my own, actually, but I had a support system that enabled me to have the food and the shelter and a transport and the, sort of Maslow's bottom line needs
Yes.
cared for so that I could do that work. And it was hard. I've analogized it or stated it. It's like an irrefutable, undeniable moral transgression sort of snaps you out of it. You go, wait a second. What do you mean I have to not talk to my mom anymore for the rest of my life? What? And when that hits you in the face where it's easy to deny or just kind of put it off or not think about it when it happens to other people, oh, well, they deserved it. Or, oh, there's some circumstances I don't understand as to why this guy has to disconnect from his mom. Or has to divorce his wife, or his kids no longer talk to him. Oh, well, I can rationalize that somehow. But when it hits home in some significant way, either to you directly or to others around you that you can't deny, you can't refute, I think that's when the shift happens.
So some tremendous break with your values would have to happen in order for you to continue to buy in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To start questioning,
Yeah.
because the whole point of extreme belief or cultic belief or going down that rabbit hole of commitment is that you're giving up or letting go of your critical thinking skills on that topic.
Right.
You just don't think about it the same way you think about other things. It's kind of analogous to falling in love. You only see the benefits, you don't see the flaws.
And how does that happen for you? Like, how did it happen for you?
Well, I see my experience as a second generation member was different from a first gen, which would be have a conversion story. For me, I grew up in it. There was never any paradigm other than the cult paradigm. So, it's not any different than growing up in a Muslim home or a Christian home, or this is just how the world is. And when your parents and all of your social connections, all the friends of my parents and family and everybody are all on the same page, you have no reason to question what's going on. And again, no critical thinking. And so nobody ever really asked me if I wanted to be a Scientologist. It was just, here it is. This is how the world is. Didn't you know, right? And it took many, many years to break out of that sort of model.
And did you go to school during those years?
I did. Yeah. Public school, public education, graduated high school. And I was recruited to start working for Scientology right out of high school. Mm-hmm. So 25 years, 2.5 decades of commitment to working for Scientology. It was above average commitment. I wasn't just a regular Joe Blow Scientologist. I was saving the world. and there's lots of, a laundry list of emotional needs being fulfilled by, those kind of activities. Mm-hmm. So it was my life commitment, and I was dead serious about it. I was a true believer. And one of the things that happened to me that I wanted to ask you about here, because I've described it as a period where there was a process done on me that was not just done on me, it's done on other people in the Church of Scientology. It's called the Truth Rundown. And I can't describe the entire thing here, but I will say that I've summarized it by calling it concentrated gaslighting, because it's a direct attack on your memory and a purposeful effort to get you to rewrite your memories. What you saw, what you experienced didn't happen. And it didn't.
That's fascinating. So how does that happen? Is that you're sitting with somebody and they're asking you to tell your story, and then one by one they're saying that never happened? Like, what is that?
It's actually worse. The way it works is in Scientology, there is a concept that if you are critical or fault finding or upset with someone or something, it's because of your own moral transgressions against that someone or something. You did something to them, or you've done things that you're withholding of a moral nature. They call these like sins in Scientology. They call these overts. And Hubbard wrote very, very clearly over and over again that overts are the cause of
Overts?
Overt acts, these sins,
Okay.
these things you do that are bad. You stole from somebody, or you lied to them, or you hurt them, or you hurt somebody around them and you didn't tell them, right? This kind of thing. This is very, very big in Scientology, and there's this procedure called the Truth Rundown, where the idea is if you are spreading what's called black PR, if you're spreading black information, misinformation, fake news, so to speak, about someone, a Scientology principal, David Miscavige, the head of Scientology, or some executive or some aspect of Scientology, if you're complaining about it, then it must be that you have these moral transgressions, and we're gonna do a confessional process on you, where you're gonna confess to all of your crimes. And if you have been spreading this bad news, like for example, I made, in all the years I was in Scientology, somewhere between $20 and $50 a week. That's the pay. That's what you get. But if you complain about that and talk about how they're denying you money and you're not making money and they don't pay their staff and it's all really bad, if you say the truth of that, they will sit you down and you will do this, and I did this Truth Rundown process. It's not everybody does this, but for the C organization, for the elite, this is part of it. And they'll make you confess. And what they're looking for is not just confessions of a random nature. They're looking for confessions of serious crimes on the subject matter on which you are being critical and spreading this bad fake news that they're calling it fake news, even though it's not. So here you are complaining about the pay. Well, that means you must have stolen some money. That means you must have ripped off the pay sum. That means you must be extorting money from the church, because otherwise you wouldn't be thinking this way and you wouldn't be spreading this black PR, see? So we're going to make you confess. And this is a very, very, it's an interrogation. It's very akin to a police interrogation, only it uses this electronic device called an e-meter. And so there's a lot of reinforcements here built in to prime you to think it's all on you.
So basically, they're making up a story, and they're giving you the new narrative that you have to swallow whole. That is absolutely not true.
In fact, you have to make up that new narrative in conformity with their demands, which makes it stick even harder, because you have to sell yourself on the fact that through this confession process, you have to sell yourself on the fact that you didn't experience what you experienced, you didn't see what you saw, and in fact, it was all due to your own crimes, and therefore you're literally rewriting your own memories of what happened to you and how you should communicate about it. And you're not done with this process until you originate on your own bat. You have to keep confessing crimes until you originate. You know what? I have been fooling everybody. I've been lying to everybody. I owe everybody an apology. And you got to write letters of apology. I lied. I said these things, and it was so bad of me. And this is the process of what's called the Truth Rundown. In a nutshell, there's lots of details, but that's it in a nutshell. And I have called this process concentrated gaslighting. It's the most powerful form of thought reform that Scientology has.
It should be against the law.
Right?
So
I wanted to give this to you because I wanted to ask you, what do you think? It's pretty, have you heard of anything else like that? Because I think that's pretty extreme.
Well, I have heard of it through the stories of other cult members, not in Scientology, but in other cult members. But I'm still fascinated, which is what brought me into this topic to begin with. Do you remember having that struggle with yourself about, but wait a minute, I saw that, or wait a minute, it's not okay to be being paid $20 or $50. I mean, this is not okay. And then grabbing onto this hook and then having to tell yourself a new narrative. Do you remember when you gave up your old narrative in favor of the other? Or did you not give it up, but you had to pretend you gave it up?
It was a little bit of both at the same time, if that, and I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but it
Oh, it
was,
does. Yes.
I had to live with two realities at the same moment, right? The cognitive dissonance was strong. Because because that's what that is, right? And it was okay. This has to be. I have to conform with this, and it has to make sense to me. Therefore, yes, my crimes, my overts, are causing me to want to speak out, be critical, be nasty, be upset. That's on me because of my stuff, and it probably wasn't as bad as I'm remembering it, because look what overts do to your memory. They make you out that you're the victim when in fact you're victimizing others. And so I've already been rewriting my memories. And so now I need to write them to what the reality of the situation was. And that's kind of what was going on in my head. Mm-hmm. So I thought I wanted to bring all of this up because I wanted to ask you about this business of memory rewrite, because I've experienced it. I've labeled it as concentrated gaslighting, because within my experience, it conforms with the definition exactly. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to ask your opinion, and also your experience with how far can that go in terms of mental health damage to people in rewriting their own emotional and real life memories.
I think it's devastating.
Yeah.
It's devastating whether there's no good news about it, right? So right. If you don't really believe it, but you have to accommodate it because this big scary person or big scary organization is telling you that this is your story and you have these overts and you're not going to get out of there until you can confess, and you do it, that's not good, because then you're subjugating to someone else and you're basically not honoring your feelings. And if you come to believe it, then you are rewriting your emotional life, which is never going to work out well for you, because this is such an interesting conversation, because we teach at the Yale Center that even though emotions come unbidden, they're connected to your cognition. So if we're taking a walk in the woods and I am someone who studies the life of spiders, and you are terrified of spiders, and we see something crawling up a tree, I might be excited because, wow, that may be a spider. And you're screaming and running in the other direction.
Right.
And so it is, in some ways, it's governed by the way you think. So what you're feeling in that situation is governed by your mindset, your predisposition with that particular thing. So how clever is it of the cult to take that knowledge that it's about the appraisal and to make you change your appraisal of the situation? No, I'm not being abused here. I'm wrong. I have the wrong idea of the way the world works. And so all I have to do is to change the way I think in order to change the way I feel, and then I'll be happy.
That's right.
And in fact, when we teach positive reappraisal, which is a really well-researched asset in emotion regulation, you're feeling, I'm really mad at you because you didn't do something that I was expecting you to do, and we're at work together. And rather than saying, he's a loser, like, why? I'm not going to do another project with him. I could reappraise the situation and say to myself, in order to have more positive feelings and to see you with more positive regard, okay, so Chris, he's kind of new on this job. He just doesn't know everything he needs to know, and he'll get up to speed. And okay, so I'm going to be good with that. Let me give him compassion, and I'll be good with that. Mm-hmm. It's a slippery slope, and it's a slippery slope because of exactly what you just described. That there's a re-education about the way the world works, and you're doing it wrong. And so when you agree that you're doing it wrong, then you're doing it right. And everyone can be happy. But you're not going to get out of that. What did you call it? A truth?
Oh, the truth rundown. Yeah.
The truth. You're not going to get out of that truth rundown until they have convinced you that you need to convince them.
That's right.
That you now know the truth, and you can apologize, ask for forgiveness. They can forgive you, and everyone's happy.
That's right. That's exactly right. And you're not done until you do that. And it's quite interesting because it can take many hours of work. I not only had that done on me, but I was in a program where I did that on 2 other people as well. It's a whole process, and it's really quite something. It's one of many such thought reform techniques that are in Scientology. There are probably a few hundred of them in that group. It's really quite extensive.
And we could actually argue the crazy making thing about it is we could potentially argue the other side of it. Well, what's bad about that?
Oh, very much so. Oh, David Miscavige would love this, right? Because he, as the leader of Scientology, because he has been accused by multiple people over the years of beating on them, of physical violence against them. And what happens after the fact of that is they receive one of these truth rundowns, or they'll get this confessional process done on them where it is made abundantly clear to them, he didn't beat on you. That's not what happened. Right? You got punished because you deserved it. That's what happened. And, right? And it's just it starts as a subtle rewrite, and then by the time you're done, oh, he never beat me. He never touched me. I was disciplined, and I deserved it. And that's how the person is now thinking about it.
So it's an all-consuming bubble of gaslighting that's out of real life. But the real, or the if you will, the softer version, and it's not at all soft, of like a softer gaslighting story that was so extreme that I didn't even think people would believe me when I was first writing stories about people experiencing it. Couple moves to another state because he is in medical school, and so her good girlfriend, connected to the relationship, follows him, and they then go out for their first anniversary after being there for a year. Their anniversary of moving to the state, of her following him, of their love. And at dinner, girl begins to tear up, and he says, I know it's wonderful that we've been here for a year together, and we love each other so much. And she's, no, well, that's right, and I do love you, but actually I'm tearing up because I miss our families in the East Coast. The guy flipped out, threw the silverware. They were in a restaurant. They threw the silverware on the floor, slammed his fist on the table, and said, fuck you for ruining our dinner. And she said, well, wait a minute. I didn't I just am tearing up. By the end of that dinner, she was on her knees at his side, at the side of the table, begging him to forgive her for ruining their dinner.
Right.
She came to me saying, Dr. Stern, why am I ruining every time we're together?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, they're made to believe they're the perpetrators.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to ask in a cult paradigm, but of course this is very much true in a coercive relationship where you have as you mentioned earlier, the power dynamics are out of whack. You have this authority figure, whether it's a cult leader, whether it's a spouse, whether it's a parent, even if we go there. You have people who are susceptible to giving a lot of breaks to individuals because of this. They grant them whatever degree of authority or care or emotional investment. Once that happens, this is the big burning question for me, for trying to help my audience is, we all commit. We all have things that we give over to, whether it's groups we're part of, religions we're part of, ideologies that we get all hyped up about. What are the red flags? What are the little bells that can go off in a person's mind that they really need to be paying attention to when these instances of gaslighting are being perpetrated on them, and they're not necessarily thinking that way? They're not like, oh, he's gaslighting me, because they're not going to go there right away.
Right.
How can they arm themselves for any situation?
Yeah. So I'll actually read you a list of the red flags, but I want to say something before I read that list, which is that it's very tempting when you're in a relationship and there are good times and not so good times, or to put it in this paradigm, abusive times and the rest of times. It's easy for your own psychological and emotional needs and for the preservation of the relationship to look at the picture of the relationship, if you could imagine it as a picture, only on the side of the good things or the rest of the things. And you ignore those things that are the abuse, or they become the figure ground exercises that your doctor makes you do when you're young and you're getting glasses, or the where some things recede into the background and some things come into the foreground. You can look at the same picture. There's a classic one where there are two women's faces, and then it recedes, and what you see is a vase instead. There are visual experiments.
Sure.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Anyway, if listeners don't, I apologize. And I would look up figure ground experiments. They're actually fascinating because it's exactly what happens. So you're looking at this picture, but you're not seeing the whole picture at the same time.
Right.
And then there is something called the halo effect, which means that, if I think you are handsome, then I'm likely to think you're smart, and I'm likely to imbue you with other good qualities.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy, if you've grown up as an accommodator, to think, you know what, it's okay, I'll just do it this way for him. Or if I want to please you, I want to make you happy. You're going to be so happy if I just agree with you. I'm just not going to give you a hard time. Or if you don't want conflict, which is another way of saying I want to please, I don't want conflict. And if you've grown up in a home where relational dynamics are such that one person gives over to someone else, rather than there being an exchange where they meet in the middle, or sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's the other, you're watching that power dynamic, and it's okay. What happens in gaslighting relationships that really happens from the beginning is that you feel your feelings at the beginning, but you don't honor them. So here I'm feeling like really nervous because we don't agree. But rather than thinking to myself, my feelings are more important than who's right and who's wrong. The fact that we're arguing and going back and forth, that's okay. But the fact that I feel bad, I'm just going to forget about that. Like, I'm going to pursue the who's right and who's wrong conversation.
Right.
Rather than opt out and say, I just, we can talk about this another time. It just doesn't feel right anymore. Or I don't want to hang around when the heat is this high in the room. So let me see if I can find you my list.
Cool. Yeah, I think you're talking about demonstrating some degree of emotional intelligence with ourselves, and sort of self-awareness of our emotional states, which is something I talk about a lot as something to sort of cultivate within yourself, because I find a lot of people don't even realize they have emotional needs, much less have an awareness that this is something they should be gauging or paying attention to in the same way you might notice if you have a stomach ache or,
Yes.
a bad leg or something, you would do something about that.
Yeah.
Emotionally,
And so right now in schools, 5,000 schools all over America and many in other places around the world, like Italy and Mexico and Spain, we are teaching young kids how to recognize, understand, label, express, and regulate their emotions. Our approach to emotional intelligence is called the ruler approach.
right.
And the undergirding of that is the mindset that emotions matter. I mean, you're saying in the life of cult, what matters is the way you think, and that can be easily manipulated. That's where they're coming in to help you do it right. Right? They're telling you about your thinking, and your feeling is obviously not important.
Right.
Nobody's schooling you on, wait a minute, if I feel fear, that means there's impending danger. What's the danger? Then that's not the conversation you're having. It's if you feel fear, you're thinking about it the wrong way.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point.
So
And you
are you being
also in that paradigm, of course, you also learn to redefine your emotions. So fear becomes respect.
yes, exactly.
Used to do that in Scientology all the time.
But it's so clever and horrific and abusive the way they do it, because the way they do it is by manipulating your thinking so that you're thinking about it differently. So I shouldn't have been afraid of him. I should have been respecting him. It's my messed up thinking.
That's right.
It's my overt.
That's
it's
right.
my sin.
That's right. That's exactly how it works. So what red flags do you have for us here?
So if you find yourself constantly second guessing yourself, asking yourself questions like, am I too sensitive? Am I too paranoid? Is this my fault? A dozen times a day.
Right.
If you feel confused and even crazy sometimes in your relationship or at work, if you're always apologizing and pointing the finger at yourself when there's something wrong in the relationship, if you're frequently wondering if you're good enough, if you can't understand why here you have this good life and yet you're really not happy, you're perhaps anxious all the time or depressed all the time. In fact, that's one of the things that people came into my therapy office with frequently. Like, I don't get it. Like, I have a really good life. Like, my husband loves me, tells me all the time, and I just am like anxious and miserable. You buy clothes for yourself or make decisions about what you're doing, thinking about your partner and his needs and whether he's going to like it rather than your own. You frequently make excuses for your partner or your cult's behavior to yourself when you're still thinking straight. And in the case of having a partner, you stop talking to people about it because you don't want to make excuses anymore and you become ashamed.
There we go.
You find yourself withholding from information from family and friends so you don't have to explain or make excuses anymore. You know something's terribly wrong, but you just can't figure out what it is. He's such a nice guy, or he's so romantic. He sends me flowers all the time, or, okay, so, he loses his temper once in a while, but he probably didn't have good parenting. You have trouble making simple decisions. You start lying to avoid being put down and to avoid having reality twists happening in your conversation, because that's the hallmark of gaslighting, that there's a pivot in the conversation. Yeah. I'm complaining to you about something you did. Suddenly it's my fault. And that's exactly what you described.
There we go.
Before your partner comes home, you run through a checklist in your head to anticipate anything you might have done wrong that day. You have a sense that you used to be a very different person, more fun-loving, more confident, experiencing more joy, more relaxed. You feel as though you can't do anything right. Your kids, your friends say things that are trying to protect you from your partner. You find yourself upset with people who you've always gotten along with before because they're challenging your life. And the worst piece is when people feel like their identity has been trampled on and their souls have been destroyed, they feel hopeless and they feel joyless.
There you go. There you go. Well, thank you very much for that list. I'm sure people will be able to relate to that pretty easily if they have those situations going on. We're unfortunately, and I am really, really amazed at how fast the time flew here. We are out of time. We have to go.
I know. I was just feeling the same. Like, I hope we can do this again, whether my pod or happy to come back here. Yeah. I think the conversation, particularly when you talked about the running through the, I'm sorry, I'm blocking the name of
the Truth Rundown. Yes.
Truth Rundown.
Yes.
It's so horrible. I'm blocking the name. Thinking about how close that is in dynamic to just reappraising the situation, how easy it is to reappraise a situation so that you feel better.
Yeah.
And everybody feels better, but it's crazy. It's crazy town. It's crazy town.
Exactly. It's the exact opposite of the truth. Rundown.
No authenticity.
No.
And no way out until you get out.
That's right. Exactly. Very much so.
So Chris, I so appreciate being here with you, and thank you. Thank you for bringing this to the world and all of your good work.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure meeting you and talking with you today and becoming familiar with your work. And, you know, we haven't even touched Hubbard's emotional tone scale, where he actually took all the emotions and graded them with numbers and put value assignments on them from top to bottom. And,
we must have that conversation.
Go over this. Yes.
We must do that. There's no question about it.
Exactly.
In the meantime, I'm going to leave you with this thought to counter that. There is an app called How We Feel, and it has a little heart icon. And it was built by a team of us at, It was built by a team of us at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence with a generous donation from the people from Pinterest. Who had an app called How We Feel. So now, did you see the little heart?
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and it is a really wonderful emotion journal. It gives you skills and tips and helps you increase your vocabulary every single day with wonderful strategies that you may never have thought of, and some that you have thought of. And I recommend people use it to check in with their feelings.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, check out the app. Check out her book, The Gaslight Effect, and The Gaslight Effect Recovery Guide, which is just coming out. I'll put links to this stuff and to your website in the description here. Thank you for your time, folks out there. Thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of this. As always, I hope that this was informative, educational, and entertaining. And I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone.